Hello, and welcome to today's Entuity Tech Talk. I'm John Diamond. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect for Entuity. And today I'm with my good friend and fellow Solutions Architect, James Denmon. If this is your first time joining us for one of these Tech Talks, they are designed for our customers and technical members of our partner community. These videos are recorded and will be available on demand. These are a great source for learning more about Entuity and reviewing features you may be interested in implementing. So today's topic is all about multi-tenancy. We'll be using the latest public release of Entuity for the demo portion of this, which is Entuity version 19. I've just got a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The call is on global mute to eliminate any noise. However, we do want these to be interactive sessions. If at any point you have questions throughout the presentation, please leave them in the chat panel and we'll be happy to answer them at the end. So let's get started. Fundamentally, we ought really to define what the term multi-tenancy is all about. So this is our definition. It's the ability to monitor multiple networks. And by the way, that really means multiple customer or department or command networks that are really belonging to separate teams of users or customers from the same Entuity installation, as though each network had their own dedicated instance of Entuity, and that could be a single server instance, it could be a multi-server instance. Allowing separate groups or divisions or commands to visualize only their specific data, basically as though this were a dedicated installation of Entuity specifically set up just for them. So, that said, I'm going to ask James to describe one approach to centrally monitoring multiple networks belonging to multiple organizations. Let's call them customers. James, how do we go about it?
All right, thank you, JD. What you see here is one of our simplest ways of utilizing multi-tenancy within your environment. This could be used with your single install with remote polling servers within your environment, but you want to be able to separate users to what they can see and report against within your system. We can do this through a couple different ways, through views as well as group memberships. And what I'm going to do next is kind of show you how you can implement this within your environment to be able to utilize this mechanism. Right. So what you can see here, I'm logged in here as the administrator, so I see everybody. We have two views, which we defined as East Coast and West Coast. We have users that have been assigned to a group that each one is associated with one of these views. And as you can see, I can go into each one of these and I can see all the content around each one of these particular sites. If I go into one of these views, I can see that we're giving them access through user groups up here. So in this scenario, the East Coast has access, has the view only. The West Coast users have no access, and neither does anybody else. So only people in the East Coast users group will be able to visually see their devices and the metrics that go along with those. If I cancel on this, I'm going to log in as the East Coast user. As you can see, I log in. I can only see the view that is associated with my user group, which is the East Coast sites. When I click into this site, I can see those two locations, and I can see the contents of those locations as well. And I do not see any other devices or views for any other location or any other group. So that is limiting my access to only provide the data that is pertinent to my environment. This also, when you're using views to separate your user groups within your environment, This also accounts for in your reporting server as well. So when you go to run a report, if you only have access to a certain view, you can only run reports against that particular view. So it comes in really handy to be able to look at the data that is only pertinent for that particular user group's environment. Right, JD?
Great. Thank you very much, James. At this point, I'm going to move on to a subtly more complex environment, and that's got overlapping IP addresses. So this is a case where we are monitoring 2 or more customer networks, and they are using IP addresses, IP address ranges that overlap with each other. For example, maybe both of these customers have allocated their IP addresses in the 10 dot range, or maybe the 192.168 IP range. At that point, it's fairly obvious that you cannot just simply route as normal from the polling servers to the customer networks. There is ambiguity between them. Now, there are techniques that have been used historically in legacy type approaches to network management that use network address translation to handle this type of arrangement, where you have different network address translation from a central monitoring station out to multiple different networks to simulate a linear address range with no overlaps. However, there are a boatload of caveats with that type of environment. It's actually very difficult to manage. We don't go in that direction. Entuity has got an alternative approach. We rely upon having multiple network interfaces on our polling servers and connecting each customer to a different network interface. Now, the operating system can't figure out where the traffic should be routed under those circumstances because you've got overlapping IP addresses. So we don't rely upon the operating system to do the routing. What we do is set up a concept within Entuity called zones. Let me show you what that actually looks like. In the administration page, there's a section here called zones. This allows you to set up multiple independent zone configurations. I'm going to show you one of them, and you will see what this actually will look like. Each zone has a name, and if each one corresponds to a different customer, it makes sense for the zone name to be the name of the customer. You can then put in a description, which is very useful for internal documentation purposes. This zone is going to identify a network interface. In fact, if you've got both IPv4 and v6 in use, you could use either or both to set this up. We provide you a menu of all of your IPv4 interfaces and another menu of all of your v6 interfaces that are available to choose from. So this is a network interface that is known to the operating system. So that binds the zone to one IPv4 or v6 interface. You can then optionally add one or more DNS server that is specific to that zone. Each customer is going to have their own way of naming devices. And if you've got DNS servers that are set up per customer, then you are able to access them using this approach. There's no point in using one common DNS server where you have overlapping IP addresses, because there would be ambiguity about a given address that may appear in more than one network, and it would certainly have different host name associated with it. You've also got a couple of extra options down the bottom, the domain suffix and the device name prefix. These are optional, and they allow you to automatically append a domain onto the end of a host name. and also to prepend a string of up to 5 characters on the start of the host name of all of the hosts that are within this zone. Got to be aware, if you're using that host name for polling, then that still has to be a valid host name from that standpoint. This option down the bottom is an alternative to using DNS. You can use a local host file for the name to IP resolution, and each zone can have its own different host file. In fact, if you look in your Entuity etc directory, there'll be a host files folder, and in there it stores the different host files if you want to use this feature for different zones. So that is how a zone is configured. Now let me just give you a few caveats. If you're going to use zones, then for each device, if we were to go in and take a look at the devices that are under management, if I were to take one of these and go in and modify it, you will see that there is a field called zone. Normally, it defaults to none, but if you've got zones configured, you will see those zones here. That allows you to put a device in a zone, so you're associating it with a given customer. If you are using zones, every single device that is under management on that server must be in a specific zone. None of them should be in the none zone. It may appear to work, but there's going to be some stings in the tail, so don't do it. The whole idea of zones is primarily to allow overlaps of IP address spaces to be handled and disambiguated. However, you can use zones even if you don't have overlapping IP address spaces. We allow you to set up multiple zones and tie them to the same network interface. And the reason you might want to do this is if you were to have multiple customers, each with their own devices being polled from a common set of servers, and you wanted to tag each device as to which customer each of the devices belong to, so that internally you can keep them apart. The zone is an attribute of the device so that it's available within the event management system, for example. If when an event is raised, you wanted to find out who it belonged to and handle it differently based upon that ownership, that's one way of doing it. So even if you've not got overlapping IPs, this approach of using zones still has value. By the way, there is also a zone setting when you set up discovery. So when you're discovering, you can say which zone should the discovery be performed for. Now I'm going to move on to the third and final configuration. And this is one that we actually use here at Park Place for our Parkview managed services offering, where we offer a managed service based upon Entuity for monitoring customer networks. Instead of using all of the polling being performed from a central location, we locate the polling or remote servers out within the customer networks. Each customer has one or more polling servers, and the customer networks are considered to be linear. They are not going to have overlapping address spaces within an individual customer. This means we don't need to use zone configurations, but then all of these remote servers are connected back to a common consolidation server. We actually host it in Azure, and we have VPN connections from that consolidation server out to the customer remote servers. So by that means, we can handle overlapping IP addresses because it doesn't matter if the IP addresses belonging to one customer overlap with another, because they're being handled by completely different remote servers. Now, there is something that I want to point out. I'm going to show you a bit of configuration that is worth knowing about here. And that is related to the user groups. Now, as James showed you earlier, you would have different user groups associated with different customers. And if I were to take one of these user groups, you will see that among the ability to permission which tools each user group were allowed to use, which reports they were allowed to see and run, which tasks they were able to execute within configuration management, there is another bit of permissioning right at the end here, the servers. I've only got one server here, but if there were to be multiple servers in this configuration, by default, they would all be listed on the right-hand column in the included column, which means that by default, members of this user group would be able to access the contents of all of those servers. In this scenario, we would only have the server or servers at that remote site, that customer site, in the included column. That's the only server or servers they would have access to. All of the other ones would be in the excluded side. So no way would they have any access to any of the data on any of the other servers. So this goes one step above and beyond the idea of segregating data by view. It also is segregating by server. So that means that you've got a higher confidence factor that you're absolutely partitioning the data belonging to different customers. So it's a very effective way of dealing with segregation of functionality and segregation of data. If you are in a position to locate your remote servers at the customer sites, this works well. If your customers only have a very small number of devices, you then have to really look at the economics of how that's going to pan out. Is it going to be economically acceptable to put a polling server to handle just a few devices at a customer site? If it is, given that these days are just VMs, then go for it. If, however, you want to have an economy of scale and poll multiple small customers from a common server or set of servers in a central location, you're probably going to want to be looking at the zone configuration, because those customers are almost certainly going to have overlapping IP addresses. So with that, I am going to invite questions. Do we have any questions posted via the chat, James?
Hey, Jenny, yes, we do. We have a couple. Do we or can we assign sub interfaces or logical interfaces to a particular zone?
Absolutely. Really, any type of interface, doesn't matter what shape or size or technology, that acts as a network interface that allows connectivity from an Entuity server out to a customer network. It might be a VPN tunnel, it might be a physical interface, it might be a virtual interface, whatever it is that allows you to make that connectivity to a customer can be used in association with zones.
Okay. We have another one. It may not be around multi-tenancy, but if they consolidate their servers, what happens to their previous device history? Do they lose that?
Right, okay, good question about multi-server operation. Because one of the things about the way Entuity does multi-server is that you don't actually have to set it up that way from the get-go. You can have an independent Entuity server and then maybe have another independent Entuity server, and later on couple them together or have a separate consolidation server that you then have trust relationships set up between the consolidation server and those existing remote servers. The important thing is, and the good news, is that any data that's already been gathered, any configuration that's already in place on those remote servers stays in place. You've got all of your history. It's simply now available within the permission structure of the system through the consolidation server. So you can build upon the foundation you already have. If, for example, you have one server in place and then you outgrow it and you need 2 or more servers in place, it is a very straightforward operation to add more servers and then put a consolidation server around it to give visibility to all of that data, including everything that's already been gathered. Do we have anything else that's come in from the audience?
We do. We have a question about zones. Can we have multiple upstream gateways in a single zone?
I think we'd have to define really what the whole meaning of the term upstream gateway was in that particular case. If you can talk to a network through a network interface that is known to the server, that can be associated with a zone. If there are multiple ways of talking, that you have to use multiple network interfaces to talk to the same customer network, maybe some parts of the network you have to use one network interface, another one you have to use a different network interface, then under those circumstances you'd really have to set up 2 zones and break that network into 2. As far as the gateways being used from a routing standpoint, provided you can route through a network interface through whichever upstream gateways you've got, then I see no reason why that shouldn't be in a single zone. If it's all of the connectivity can be set up from from a single network interface on a server, then that should be the case. One thing to note that I didn't mention is that if you are setting this up on a Linux server, you may need to set up some source routing definitions. If you get to that point, our support team is going to be in a position to help. Anything else, James?
There is another question. Is there a way to implement the multi-tenancy into a TrueSite integration?
Where you've got TrueSite, the incidents would be forwarded to TrueSite from your servers. You would probably want to tag them in some way or another, or at least work out a way based upon view membership to be able to tag them. What would make sense is for TrueSite to be aware of the zone configuration for each device. So when an incident is forwarded to TrueSite, it has access to know the zone, which will identify the customer. Now, what would be important under those circumstances would be to provide the zone name rather than the zone ID. The zone name would be far more meaningful. And that also avoids a confusion where if you've got multiple servers taking part in this for polling purposes, each zone for a given customer could have a different zone ID on different servers. So in that case, you really are interested in the zone name, which would be consistent across all of the servers. But if that zone could be made available to TrueSite in the form as packaged as part of the incident that is forwarded to TrueSite to open up a TrueSite event, then I could see that certainly being of value to identify which customer each incident belonged to.
Yeah, he followed up with that when it's going into TrueSite presentation server and adding the Entuity consolidation or pollers in different presentation server realms for different clients. Would it still act the same?
From that standpoint, the user that would be logging in, who would almost certainly be coming in through RSSO for the authentication, would be associated with an RSSO configuration of Entuity. So the user account, when they log in through RSSO, when they access Entuity, they're going to be accessing under their user account, which means they would only see information that was associated with them. And so, although I've never done it, my assumption is that that would only give them access to their data and not anybody else's.
Ready? We do have another question. It's about zones and discovery. They've already discovered their devices and they've edited their profile and added in zones. Will Entuity automatically add existing discovery devices into the new zones?
So if those are devices that are already under management without a zone definition, simply rediscovering over that range using auto discovery will not change any settings on those devices. So you would have to go in and manually assign each device to a specific zone. If you had an enormous number of them and you didn't want to go in individually to make such a change, we should be in a position to help you automate that, potentially via configuration management. I've done settings in the past, helping customers to automate the setting, for example, of custom attributes on devices. They don't actually have to be custom attributes. They could be standard editable attributes, but allowing you to select multiple devices and saying, I want to make a change, common change to this attribute on all of those devices in one fell swoop using configuration management. So it doesn't actually make any changes to the devices themselves, just their configuration within Entuity. That type of approach could potentially be used under these circumstances.
Could they also multi-select devices and change the zone?
That, in reality, I think you're going to be allowed to do that within the asset management. So here, for example, if I were to go back to what I was just showing you a moment ago, if we were to take multiple devices, I'm just going to take these 3 devices and go in and in fact, let's take a couple of devices here that are of the same type, servers, modify the asset. You could make a zone change to all of them in one go. So if you've got the same types of devices, you can go in and do a multiple selection here. You're correct, James.
Okay. We had a follow-up question about the presentation server. Do we need to add a consolidation server for each presentation server realm?
I can't say for sure, but I wouldn't have thought so.
I wouldn't have either. And that's all the questions I think we have right so far. If there's anything else, please type it in the chat window.
If we don't get to your question before we finish, we will follow up by email.
Absolutely.
Okay, so great questions, everyone, and thank you for spending time with us today. If we don't get to your questions live, we will follow up post-webinar. This Tech Talk will be available online to re-listen or share out with your greater team. We'll be sending you all a link to the recording as soon as we can. If you have any suggestions for our next Tech Talk topic or others in the future, please let us know in the chat or reach out to your Entuity account manager or simply reply to the follow-up email you'll be receiving from us. We do like to hear from you about what topics you would like us to cover. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.